All right, so we're going to get back into actually making videos for stuff during quarantine. The AP exam is over. This is all, I mean, technically all of this has been optional for the whole quarter, but this is the stuff that's most relevant, and I feel this one is especially relevant these days. For both topics, I'm really going to go over. There's so much that happens in the Nixon presidency that it is deserving of its own video, and we're going to take a look at it. So Nixon campaigns in 1968 after Lyndon Johnson says that he will not be campaigning. That he goes with the idea of peace with honor and appealed to the silent majority. He said that there is a large group of the American public that is not talking in politics, that is not participating, but they all believe that what's going on is wrong. And more or less, he tapped into something that way. That, yeah, there are bunches of people who aren't participating because they just don't want to get involved. Well, I just don't agree with the politics kind of thing. And that has been tapped into as a conservative bulwark ever since. And it is important to note that Nixon lays out the plan to end the war through the process of diplomatic negotiation and what is called Vietnamization. Vietnamization is handing over control of the war to the South Vietnamese. That we don't need to be involved, we shouldn't be involved, and we should teach them how to handle their problems, which, if we followed that from the beginning, it might have been a whole different thing. The Americans all hoped that the war would end, but they didn't like that the protesters that were going out and protesting against. It's a very complicated time of America hating the war, at the same time supporting the troops, at the same time hating the protesters. So you can see in some of the this statistic is really telling. That support for the war was measured by no responses to the questions asked. In view of developments since we entered fighting, is it a mistake sending troops in? You can see that, early in August of 65, 60 plus percent of the population is saying that we should have gone into Vietnam. It was the right decision. And as it goes and goes and goes, how many people are saying that's the right decision drops and drops and drops. And that's really the key to all this. As this is going on, Woodstock would be a 3-day concert that is the peak of the hippie movement, and I'll link the video I found about that because I know that's going to get flagged if I do that, if I go ahead and just play it. So I'll skip over that. Perhaps the biggest thing in world history happens, and Richard Nixon happens to be president during it. Nothing to do with Nixon himself, but he's the president when it happens. Usually when I pose this question and when I start with this in class, it starts with asking about the 100 Years' War. And most times I get very few answers or very vague answers. You get French and British. You might get a time period. You get people saying it's 100 years long. And so I point out the facts that, yeah, it was between the French and the British. It was from 1337 to 1453, so it was actually more than 100 years. It was actually 3 significant phases. Let's put it this way. Looking back after a few centuries, what was the dominant thing of lifetimes and 3 very significant wars that now looking back are just blended into one actual war that we tend to just forget because it just doesn't feel relevant. It was so long ago. Historians are already looking at World Wars I and II as one war with a ceasefire in the middle, that they're so connected 1 to 2 that they're the same conflict. And as we get further and further out, they're going to be seen as one big conflict, and as it'll eventually fade into memory the same way that the 100 Years' War did. So all of the things that we take as the big moments in world history slowly fade away. I argue that there's one thing that is going to be a marker for at least a millennium, and that is when we first set foot on another surface. For the first time, human beings walked on something that wasn't the earth. And that is something that is going to truly stand up as a significant thing, on par with Columbus. We might not think of it so much now, but when we're a spacefaring society and moving out among the stars, this is going to be the moment they look back to on where did it start. And the 1500s aren't really thought about as far as what happens in exploration, but we know what the impact was. We remember Columbus. So let's take a look at Apollo 11. If I can get my...
40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Michael Collins, would be in lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin would crawl into the lunar lander, which was separate from the main spacecraft, the Apollo capsule, named Columbia. And Eagle, the name for the lunar lander, would make the descent. There are parts of the lunar lander that are no thicker than tinfoil. It is not designed to operate in an atmosphere of any kind, so it's no need for aerodynamics. There's no need for extra strength. It is there to simply do its job.
As wings. On its own now, but with Columbia near at hand, it coasted around to the backside of the moon, and there, while out of direct communication with the Earth, it fired its engine to slow its descent to a touchdown on the near side of the moon. Collins in Columbia continued in orbit, awaiting their return.
Okay, all flight controllers, gonna go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. You're looking great.
How you doing, Control?
We look good here, fine.
How about you, Telcom? Go. Guidance, you happy?
Go.
Fido.
Go.
2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag. 47 degrees. Roger. 47 degrees.
Still looking very good.
Your go. Stop alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
That 1201 alarm is a computer error. It's an error that could have been something that made the mission abort, and everyone would have had to basically pack up and go home. The error is essentially saying that the computer is overloaded, and at this point, that's like 50 kilobytes of data. The computer, someone in that room at Mission Control remembered what that alarm was among a list of 1,500, 2,000 different possible computer errors that could be outloaded from the computer. We were talking, let's put it this way. The spacecraft that directly preceded the Apollo had the same computing function as a 4-function calculator. Your phones are literally 100 million times better in computing than what we went to the moon with. So this computer is completely overloaded, and they have to make the decision, is this okay to work with? In the end, they will reset it, and then you'll hear a 1202, which is a very similar error. And again, they'll restart the computer.
1201 alarm.
Same type, we're go, flight.
Okay, we're go.
We're go. Same type. We're go.
Altitude 1,600.
Eagle looking great. Roger, 1202. We copy it. 35 degrees. 750. Coming down to 23. 540 feet and at 15. 1050 feet down at 4. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down. 220 feet.
It's around this time that Neil Armstrong realizes that the place that the computer is programmed to set down in, most of that was going to be pre-programmed, and the astronauts merely had to monitor it. Well, that crater that they were supposed to land in was actually a pile of boulders, and if they don't have a perfectly level landing, they're not going to be able to launch back off at the right orbit to meet back with Michael Collins, who is still in the Apollo capsule, and then go home. They would be trapped on the moon forever. So Neil Armstrong, an incredible test pilot, takes the control of the Eagle to slowly maneuver it down and land on his own. And if you've ever played the minigame Lunar Lander, you know how tough that can be, and that's obviously way oversimplified. I'll see if I can find a link. It's a great game. So in this, you will hear Buzz Aldrin calling out how much time is left to in the fuel to land. When he says 60 seconds, that means there is 60 seconds left of fuel before they run out, crash, and they're on the moon forever.
11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet, 4.5 down, 5.5 down, 100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet, guys looking good, down a half. 6 forward, 60 seconds. Lights on, forward, forward, 40 feet, down 2.5, picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Tranquility Base. The Sea of Tranquility is where the lunar lander set down. Armstrong felt it was no longer appropriate to say it's just simply the spacecraft. It's not just Eagle at this point. They've landed. They've created a base. And the next line is, we copy it down, Eagle. You've got a bunch of guys here about to turn blue. We're breathing again. It's one of the most hectic moments in world history, and the whole world was watching on television. Just 2 hours later, after changing spacesuits, Neil Armstrong would make the first step onto an alien world. The camera is on one of the other legs of the lunar lander.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming. Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That hasn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up.
Roger, we copy.
It's a pretty good little jump. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the LEM. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This was the big moment. This is the greatest, as far as a percentage of the planet, of the most people watching a broadcast at the same time. The whole world watched that we landed on the moon. And that first line, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, that Neil Armstrong was only taking a single step, a foot away from where he was. But with that step came so many, I mean, it was $20 billion in 1960s dollars to get to the moon. And hundreds of thousands of workers all working for this same purpose, to develop the technologies involved. You think of all the places like Lockheed Martin and these big companies like Boeing that put things together for the spacecraft, but it was a bra company that actually they won the contract to make the spacesuits. That they knew how to sew complex materials that are very delicate yet tough, and they're the ones who made it. This was really an all hands on deck thing, and we have the plaque that is on the lunar lander and is still there to this day. Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. That we claimed the moon for everyone. We claimed it so it could not be somewhere where you could plant missiles. We defeat that overall Soviet idea that what if they put missiles up there? And then let's take a look at the planting of the flag. You have to imagine that cameras were huge and not very good back then.
How is the quality of the TV?
Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
And you're broadcasting from 250,000 miles away on
Oh,
something
geez,
that
that's
was
great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
super
Yes, indeed.
light.
They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes from the lunar surface.
Expenses of carrying something heavy just weren't feasible.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
There are wires hung inside the flag to give that appearance, because there is no wind, no atmosphere on the moon, and it would simply flop down. You see a lot of momentum of it waving back and forth. There's not even atmosphere to slow down that waving. It's pretty incredible that, so NASA established on the right what the plan was as they moved around the moon. And just 5 years ago, a lunar orbiter was able to get a picture of the Apollo 11 landing site, and it matches perfectly. That you can still see every footprint. And there was a series on History Channel called Life After People, and it was like, what if we disappeared? What would happen to the planet? And you're watching all the things decay and fade away. They said the last thing on the Earth was likely going to be Mount Rushmore though it would look far different. And the last thing of humanity is probably the stuff on the moon, because unless something directly hits it from space, it'll be there forever. Usually I talk about Apollo 13 because it was a uniting factor, a tragedy in space that came to be one of NASA's greatest successes. I think I'll post a video of that because if I use the movie clips, I'm going to get blocked. Instead, let's take a look from the rest of the lunar landings. There would be 12 men in 6 missions that would land on the moon. Many of them are, we're losing them to time. And so to think that the smallest group of people and what they were able to do. Well.
Hey, John, while you're sampling there, you might look around and see if you see any vesicular basalt.
That's what I'm looking for.
Good show. I told him you were.
Whoop! Okay.
We see that one went all the way in.
Not quite. But there it is, all but about 5 inches.
Okay.
And that one was smooth.
Okay, and John, stand by for a feed water tone.
Just got it.
How's that?
The hope. Hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale. Da 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 da. Hippity hopping along. I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May, when much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Do-do-do-do-do. Oh, is this a neat way to travel? Isn't it great? Dum-da-dum-dum-dum. 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 I like to skip along. Not me, boy. Skip.
And Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space on the Apollo 14 mission, he brought along a head of a golf club, attached it to the one of the shovels, and hit 3 golf balls on the moon.
Genuine 6-iron on the bottom of it is my Mustang. I have a little white pellet that's familiar to millions of Americans. Drop it down. Unfortunately, the suit is so stiff I can't do this with 2 hands, but I'm going to try a little sand trap shot here. They got more dirt than ball that side. Got more dirt than ball. Here we go again.
That looked like a slice to me, Al.
There we go. Ready to die. One more. Miles and miles and miles.
Very good, Al.
And you have to realize that with all these things going on, these are full career Army, Navy, Air Force individuals, and they had the mouths to match, and actually got NASA in a lot of trouble for what they talked about on the moon. There is one clip from Apollo 16 about John Young talks about how the food is affecting him. It's hilarious. Totally can't share it. But as they get further into the missions, the American people get less and less interested, but we do get the lunar rover out there to actually get some real intense exploration. This version of the footage is motion balanced. You can see that's why the outer edge is bouncing around so crazy. But it makes it so that you actually get a smooth image and what it actually would look like if you were standing on the moon. It's pretty surreal. the dust kicking up there is actually the best way to prove that the moon landings actually exist, which I've had as a teacher. I've had to deal with. It's stupid, but well, it absolutely happened, and that dust cloud can't happen on Earth no matter what you do to it. Not the directions it goes. There's a lot of trigonometry involved. And you can see just how far some of these things went. And if you ever wondered what, if you were to drop a feather on Earth, we know that in gravity all things fall at the same rate. Galileo figured that out a long time ago. But everyone likes to say, well, what about a feather? And then like, well, there's air resistance for a feather. So on Apollo 13,
Kim, we copied a both solar wind and penetrometer drum in the ETB.
Not quite yet. I haven't put the solar wind in yet, but I will shortly. I want to watch this. Joe, you have a good picture there. I've got
beautiful picture, Dave.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
How about that indeed? In 1972, the last Apollo mission lifted off from the moon. And by remote camera, they actually screwed this up a few times in the last previous mission.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1.
This is the last time humans were ever
on our way, Houston. Vector your good. X-Thought.
Since then, we've all been very much earthbound.
Pitch over.
Roger, you have good thrust.
Okay, 30 seconds. 308 your number. Okay, coming through 1,500 feet. And H-dot looks good.
But what the biggest thing that came out of the Apollo program was actually looking back at Earth. And this is a photo from that last mission on Apollo 17. And I will I will link Neil deGrasse Tyson's approach of we stopped dreaming, that we went to the moon and we saw the Earth. I think I might have connected it last time, that things like Earth Day and all these environmental programs happened under Richard Nixon, who is not something you think about for the environment, but it totally was. That the fact that we haven't gone back 50 years later is tragic. And I hope that within my lifetime, we'll get to see human beings reach out into the void once again. So let's bring it back down to Earth. There's the nice story for the lesson. It only gets worse from here. In 1971, we start talking about troop withdrawals, and Vietnam gets worse because of it. Because everyone knew that the war had an end in sight, that we were planning on leaving, you get a lot of dissent within the military of people not wanting to go out, refusing to go on patrols. Why am I putting my life on the line for a war that's winding down? There's no point. Why am I going to die needlessly if we're just going to leave? And you even got as extreme as fragging officers, where new recruits would toss hand grenades close enough to an officer to at least immobilize them and put them either wound them so that they're put in the hospital and they can't lead you on these missions. That's extremely not something you think about when you think about the U.S. military. But this is what happens when you have the draft and you have a very unpopular war that's gone on for 19 years and now an end in sight.
When the sun goes down at Kent State University, the lights come on to remember the 4 students who died 40 years ago at the height of the Vietnam War. Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandy Scheuer, and Bill Schroeder. President Richard Nixon's expansion of the war into Cambodia in April 1970 produced a wave of student protests on campuses across the country. In Ohio, the National Guard was dispatched to Kent State University after anti-war protesters on campus turned violent at the start of May. On May 4th, a noontime rally turned bloody when National Guardsmen, who had been ordered to disperse the demonstrators, advanced on the angry crowd and wound up firing on them. This photo, snapped just moments after the shooting stopped, became one of the iconic images of the Vietnam War era. In addition to the 4 students who were killed, 9 others were injured. Every year, people look back on May 4th. At the university, it's a day of emotion. After 40 years, it's still a moment frozen in time. Ross Simpson, The Associated Press.
Vietnam would end shortly thereafter. We would remove all troops, and there'd be no provisions for what happens to prisoners of war or those missing in action. The last American troops left South Vietnam in 1973. 2 years later, North Vietnam would conquer Saigon. It would be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. There were 240 Medal of Honor winners. 58,000 Americans killed, 75,000 extremely with severe disabilities, 23,000 more. It just gets worse and worse and worse the more you read, and there are still 1,600 Americans that we don't know what happened to them. And considering how long some of our soldiers were in prisoners of war camps, they could, in theory, still be there. It's a very sad and tragic war that we have not fully dealt with yet. And instead of including this video, I'll link it in the lesson. Other things going on, moving away from Vietnam. The Supreme Court has a lot of activism at this point. It's named the Warren Court for who was the Supreme Court the head Supreme Court justice. That Griswold versus Connecticut would shut down the state laws prohibiting the use of contraceptives. That goes back to a lot of the stuff we talked about in the 1920s. Finally, this stuff is toned down. Gideon v. Wainwright, all defendants you are guaranteed to have legal counsel. If you cannot afford counsel, you will have a public defender. In 66, the Miranda, you all know that, the Miranda warning, you have the right to remain silent and so on. That is, you have to have your rights explained to you, though there are certainly exceptions in that that have moved on. It's not like it's a technicality. If you don't get read your rights, you still committed the crime. Separation of church and state means that you get a lot less with prayers in school. Previously, like with the following the Pledge of Allegiance, everyone would have a prayer, and that prayer would be read by the teacher or over the public address, and everyone would have to participate. Now, we get more and more of your rights. You don't even have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and that's caused a lot of turmoil nationwide, but it's your rights. And then Reynolds versus Sims, the state legislatures, especially in the South, would make it so that, okay, let's put all of our 2 million minority groups in 2 million people who are of people of color in one district represented by one person, and then we'll put our 100,000 white people with here's one representative, here's another 100,000 with one representative, here's another 100,000 with one representative. You had to make it even. You couldn't just ball up all of your groups that you didn't want to have representation into one representative. You actually had to have it spaced out according to the proportions. All of your districts had to be roughly the same proportion of population. You can't screw around with districting that way. We get women's liberation. The women's lib movement is what follows the feminism we saw of the 1920s. Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique, which inspires JFK to create the Commission on the Status of Women. Found that widespread discrimination, did not go far enough. The Equal Pay Act in 1963 is created. 1966, the National Organization of Women is created. Certainly not a fix, but these are things that are the initial establishments of what we're working towards. 1973 Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade is the case on abortion. Not going to get deep into that one, but I don't think a lot of people realize what the actual laws are now that were set by Roe v. Wade. In the first trimester, no state may prohibit an abortion. The second trimester, it is up to each individual state whether or not it wants to allow an abortion. And the third trimester, no state may allow an abortion. It is a segmented system. And that's the law as it stands today. Most people don't realize that there's actually nuance in it. Title IX, which is so relevant to everything. It bans sex discrimination in all aspects of education. You'll hear it especially in athletics, that's where most women's sports organizations begin, and all anything in education is required to have them and not just brush them off of, oh, they don't need them. We get banning and discrimination for credit. The military academies are open to women. But the Equal Rights Amendment will eventually be defeated. That Equal Rights Amendment was supposed to make it so that everything, that you could not discriminate anything on the basis of sex, and it was shot down. Just like in the 1920s when we first saw a push towards this kind of idea, there were things where women where groups felt that women had greater protection in various things, and if they did this, that would eliminate that. And one of those things was the draft. That women, I'm still not sure if women have to register for the draft. As far as I know, no, but that they keep talking of changing that. And so if they pass the Equal Rights Amendment, women would have to enter the draft as well, and there are an awful lot of women who did not want to do that. What you see in the picture there is a bra burning. That was one of the big significant symbols of this movement. That was something that men were forcing women to do, and so that they were burning them in protest. Usually, if you hear anything about the women's lib movement, bra burning is thrown in there immediately. So I definitely want you to know what's going on there. Nixon and the environment. This is where I include the We Stop Dreaming. Okay, I knew I put it somewhere. You never think of Nixon as being environmentally friendly. It's probably one of the last things you think about for Richard Nixon. But the Environmental Protection Agency is created in his tenure in 1970. Earth Day was first made in 1970. Clean Air Act, Water Pollution Control, the Endangered Species Act would follow right after that. And the national speed limit would limit things to 55, which certainly upset musicians like Sammy Hagar, who could not drive 55. The idea was that by lowering the speed limit, you would not only make things much safer, but you would save a lot of gasoline, and that was a key idea. All of these things are born under Richard Nixon, and I credit, and others will credit, the space program. So I'm going to skip over this, but I'll link it. The other big thing that Nixon never gets enough credit for is that Nixon opens communist China. He is the first diplomatic mission to China, the first president to talk to China. And oddly enough, it came through ping pong diplomacy, where our national table tennis team played against China and did a tour of the country playing against various table tennis teams, because I don't know if it still is, but it was super popular in China. It's an Olympic sport. So doing that started to open a lot of doors of, hey, America isn't so terrible. And we looked at a lot of things and said, hey, China isn't so terrible. And this is the first step to what we have today, with China being so woven into all of our economics. So it took Nixon to go to China. You don't think of him as being the diplomat, but surprising guy. What isn't surprising is what you should all associate Richard Nixon with, and that is the Watergate scandal. Nixon was paranoid about re-election. He wanted to make sure he won in 1972, so this is the broadest overview. He has a group break into Democratic headquarters, which is in the Watergate Hotel down along the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. It's still there. You can drive past it. It just sold to a group, actually. They're trying to revitalize it. So, what happened? In 1971, there were internal documents saying that the Vietnam War had to continue and had to be won so it wouldn't be a national embarrassment. Those papers leak via the New York Times. It's called the Pentagon Papers. That, okay, we've had all this big talk about limiting communism. This is the right thing to do, small nations, domino theory. But we're at the point where we're sending our boys to die because we don't want to be embarrassed. And that in itself is a massive national embarrassment. So Nixon creates a task force in his administration to control information and stops leaks. He hates the leaks. Got to stop the leaks. And so this group was called the Plumbers because they stop leaks. One of these plumbers, G. Gordon Liddy, who will come up throughout this, is transferred from the Plumbers to the Committee to Re-elect the President, Nixon's fundraising arm of his campaign. Officially, it's abbreviated as CRP, which is a pretty terrible acronym on its own, but everyone refers to it even worse as CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. I mean, that's hilarious. And the info control is a key part of this campaign. As this is happening, in May of 1972, Liddy's team breaks into the Watergate Hotel to wiretap phones so that they know what everything's happening in the Democratic National Convention, the committee. What are they doing? And I put a lot of dates on this, not because the dates are important, but the timeline is somewhat important, so you have an idea of how much space we're talking. This takes a much longer time than anyone gives it credit for. In June of 72, 5 men, you can see their mugshots there, are arrested for breaking into the Watergate Hotel. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post do journalism so intense that it becomes a fantastic movie that they are looking at. That's called All the President's Men, where they look into this, and they are going to be throughout uncovering so much of this dirt. They find that a $25,000 check for Nixon's campaign is found in one of the bank accounts of one of the Watergate robbers, so that there is a connection between the president's re-election and this break-in. They weren't just burglars. Follow the money, they say. August 30th, the White House counsel John Dean says the robbery was investigated and there's no connection. So the lawyer for the White House says that it's not connected to the White House. A month later, it's discovered that there was a slush fund by the Attorney General having extra money to investigate Democrats, how to find dirt on their opponents. Mitchell threatens people at the Washington Post, saying that if you publish any of this, we'll go after you. The Washington Post turns around and publishes what he just threatened. But November 7th, Nixon defeats George McGovern in a massive landslide. That is the electoral map. You don't get much more red than that. So at the beginning of the next year, 1973, G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord, the former director of CREEP, are convicted with this break-in, and the 4 others plead guilty. The judge will threaten long sentences if they don't talk. Nixon and the White House counsel start talking about bribes to keep the burglars silent, saying they could take $1 million each. Then McCord confesses that there is a conspiracy, and it certainly does not look good that the president is talking about bribes to cover things up. New York Times finds that all of this, that they're paying the burglars directly through they go through the banks. They publish all this. We get publicly televised hearings. We find out that Nixon has been recording conversations since at least 1971, that tapes of everything said in the White House exist. And Nixon was not alone in this. There's actually recorded conversation of him complaining that, Kennedy recorded all of his stuff, and everyone loved Kennedy. Kennedy also didn't try and rig an election. So Nixon orders the end of the taping system, get it removed. Nixon refuses to give up the tapes, and he gives a speech to the nation about what's going on.
Good evening. Now that most of the major witnesses in the Watergate phase of the Senate committee hearings on campaign practices have been heard, the time has come for me to speak out about the charges made and to provide a perspective on the issue for the American people. For over 4 months, Watergate has dominated the news media. During the past 3 months, the 3 major networks have devoted an average of over 22 hours of television time each week to this subject. The Senate committee has heard over 2 million words of testimony. This investigation began as an effort to discover the facts about the break-in and bugging of the Democratic National Headquarters and other campaign abuses. But as the weeks have gone by, it has become clear that both the hearings themselves and some of the commentaries on them have become increasingly absorbed in an effort to implicate the president personally in the illegal activities that took place. Because the abuses occurred during my administration and in the campaign for my re-election, I accept full responsibility for them. I regret that these events took place, and I do not question the right of a Senate committee to investigate charges made against the President to the extent that this is relevant to legislative duties. However, it is my constitutional responsibility to defend the integrity of this great office against false charges. I also believe that it is important to address the overriding question of what we as a nation can learn from this experience and what we should now do. I intend to discuss both of these subjects tonight.
So it's the media saying that look, the media is talking about this far too much, and that this has become political. It's just trying to get the president. Can't imagine where we've heard such things. The vice president will resign in a completely unrelated thing. Spiro Agnew resigns because he is being charged with bribery and tax evasion. Nothing to do with the Watergate break-in. Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford is nominated as the vice president, and when Nixon resigns, he will be the only president who was never elected. He was nominated as VP and just put into place, and then he becomes the president. So you don't need to win an election in order to be the president, apparently. Then we get what's called the Saturday Night Massacre, and you'll hear this referred to various times if you watch enough CNN. In October 19th, Nixon wants to avoid handing over his tapes. He says he's going to have a senator named John Stennis summarize the tapes and give that to the courts. The next day, the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, refuses the offer for summaries. He says summaries aren't good enough, I want the actual tapes. So that same day, Nixon orders the firing of Cox. The Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General refuse to fire the special prosecutor, saying that's a special prosecutor. They're supposed to be able to do what they want, and they resign. And they eventually go far enough down the ladder that the Solicitor General will fire Archibald Cox, and they get in a new special investigator who Nixon feels will be more friendly to him. It is at this time that Nixon will give a speech that he is best known for.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Yes, sir.
Nixon getting in there. And anyone who watches Futurama, that's what it's all based on. So, November 21st, 1973, it's revealed that there is an 18-minute gap in the tapes. It's unexplained. Eventually, they get a secretary saying, oh, no, I accidentally erased that. Likely not. By April, again, this is taking a very long time, 1,200 pages of edited transcripts are released. In May, the House Judiciary Committee sees these transcripts and starts the impeachment proceedings. The Supreme Court will rule that Nixon must turn over the tapes in a case called United States v. Nixon. July 27th, 3 articles of impeachment are approved. They are not voted on, so Nixon was never actually impeached, but they had the articles of impeachment ready for the vote. They were obstruction of justice, misuse of power, and contempt of Congress, that he wasn't giving over the things he was supposed to. Days later, 3 conversations, the transcripts are released that directly reveal Nixon being involved in the cover-up, and they refer to this as the smoking gun. Well, why didn't Congress vote on articles of impeachment? Because on August 8th, he resigns.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issue of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
And so we get the only president ever to resign. Months later, Gerald Ford would pardon Nixon.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule.
And so Ford is essentially saying that there's no need for this long, drawn-out investigation. That it would. I mean, Richard Nixon, just because he leaves the presidency, doesn't mean he still didn't commit crimes in trying to hold on to the presidency. And so he may have been indicted and put in jail. And Ford reasons that that's not worth it. So he gives Nixon a pardon, and everyone is to move on. And if I can explain Jerry Ford's presidency in one clip, I'm going with this one.
For President Ford, the year seemed full of snags. In June, he fell down the plane steps on arriving in Austria. But a whole lot more serious were the two attempts to assassinate him. The first occurred on September 5th as the president was walking to the Capitol building in Sacramento, California.
Yeah, Gerald Ford, not well liked. He played football at Michigan, and they basically consider him a giant buffoon, and he did nothing to stop that image. The first in a long line of presidents where you're going, wow, that education's really paying off. But that's all politicians, isn't it? So that's going to wrap up my look at the Nixon presidency. It took a long time. There's a lot that happened during Richard Nixon's presidency. You wouldn't think. We're talking about 4-ish years here. There's an awful lot that happened that's very, very significant. And usually we just write them off as Watergate. So I'll leave it at that. That's my presentation for this one. We'll continue on into Ford, Carter, and Reagan in the upcoming videos. Thanks for staying tuned. Thanks for watching.